our special edition of Beyond Screens, featuring IndieCade nominees and finalists from the 2022 festival. I'm Celia Pearce. I'm the host of Beyond Screens and also the co-founder of IndieCade. And I'm super excited today to have one of our non-screen based IndieCade nominees, Laura Beke, who is a Dutch, let's see if I can get this right, a Dutch PhD candidate and game scholar currently living in Norway.
That's right.
And Laura's game, it's called, I totally blanked out on the name now.
Long Story.
Long Story.
A deep time
Long
LARP.
Story, a deep time LARP. So I'm trying to decide where to start because there's a lot to unpack with this game actually. Maybe we could start with you just giving a little bit of a summary of what the game is about to start with, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So the game is a chamber LARP. So it's meant to be played by a rather small group of people, let's say 5 to 15. And it's meant to be played in a black box space, a single room, sort of very minimal on the props, no costumes, nothing elaborate, nothing fancy. Although it's meant to, it does take one facilitator. So in the past playthroughs, that has been me. And the premise of the game is that you players play stakeholder species who travel on a time machine, and they make these consecutive jumps through time, each one further into the future than the former. And over the course of this journey, they see the Earth, or actually they speak the Earth changing, and they themselves, their characters also have the opportunity to change and to adapt with the changing environment.
Cool. It's funny because in your statement, you said you didn't think it was that innovative, and I completely disagree with that assessment. I will say that IndieCade, by definition, accepts the most innovative games, so right away that disqualifies it from not being innovative. But there were a couple of other things about it that really, really struck me as kind of groundbreaking. One of them was just the way you deal with time, which is typically in LARPs done in a somewhat real-time way. Sometimes there'll be chapters where there's a gap between, but I've never really seen a game that really messed around with the timeline in such a clear way. And it kind of leads to my first question for the audience, because they might not know the answer to this question. What exactly is deep time?
Yeah, deep time is a notion that was coined into the 1800s, late 1800s by a geologist. And it's deep time is vast amounts of time, right? Time that dwarfs the human. Deep time, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years into the past. This is the time scale at which you can see species evolving. You can see kind of the continent shifting over the face of the Earth. You can see climate changing. These days, climate change a bit faster now, but that has everything to do with our impact on the planet. But generally, you can see those things more, you can see them occurring in deep time.
So this really struck me when I read it, because I was like, oh, this is a classic example of a scientific principle that is really, really hard for people to grasp. Like, this is something I've worked on a few projects around climate change. And one of the things that comes up again and again is how hard it is for people to understand long-term, large-scale systems. And so this is another example of like a scientific idea that like it is really, really hard for us to fathom geological time. And we can see that. I think one of the big problems with people's resistance to climate change is there's this kind of sort of apocalyptic procrastination mentality, like, oh, well, that's not going to happen while I'm still alive, so why should I care, right? And this kind of way of thinking about time really is quite different. And I love that you picked a LARP, because obviously of all game genres, a LARP happens in real time in a really, really tangible way. So to translate and abstract those kinds of large deep time leaps you're talking about into like an embodied analog game, I thought was a very ambitious undertaking, and really exciting. And then the other thing that really struck me about it too was that there are not a lot of LARPs that deal with science. We've had a lot of board games and digital games at IndieCade with scientific content. We've had things like I think it was called Terra Nova or something like that from
Oh, Terra
University of
Nil?
the one from the University of Chicago, which is an ARG about climate change. Um, but live games about science, like embodied live games, are very rare. So I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a deep dive with you into like what got you interested. Like, how did you even decide you wanted to do this?
Yeah. Yeah, God knows. No, I think so. I'm a PhD fellow, and my project is, or my dissertation is called Anthropocene Temporalities in Video Games. And for that project, I look at ways in which are like the temporal. We have to sort of dig deep for my the blurb now. It's sort of I handed it in, and now it's like gone from my mind. But it's basically looking for temporalities in video games that resonate with the temporalities that are being felt and experienced in the current moment. And one of those temporalities is deep time, right? And so arguably, because of what's going on, because we are living in what has been proposed to be a new geological age, the Anthropocene, in which physical parameters of the global climate have been shifted. Arguably, we can sort of sense ourselves in deep time, right? Because if you look at the history of planet Earth, there have been mass extinctions before ours, right? There's been the one that killed the dinosaurs, the asteroid strike. That was like 60 million years ago, right? But if you look at sort of the record of deep time, you can see these peaks, right? When mass extinctions have happened. And ours is the most current one. We're currently living through what is called the sixth mass extinction because of the numbers of species that are going extinct because of climate change, because of unsustainable land use, ocean acidification, that kind of stuff. So we can see ourselves as part of that pattern, right? Now, there's a little bit of a difference, of course, because the climate crisis is an anthropogenic crisis. It's a crisis that we've created ourselves, and the former ones have been non-anthropogenic. But there is this sense that we've sort of realized again that human civilization is subject to and kind of bounded by planetary time, right? The time of geology. And so that is a temporality that I, in my dissertation, have looked at in video games and video games like Outer Wilds and Heaven's Vault. Those are my sort of case studies there. But I was also interested, I am super interested in analog games as well, TTRPGs, LARP. And so I was sort of interested in doing something with LARP because I was also missing the multiplayer element in my corpus. So I mainly look at single player games, and as much as they are great, it was fun to play and super interesting, I think something else happens when you involve other human players. You just open up this dimension for kind of a different kind of sociality, a different kind of surprise, right? Surprising results could happen, uncertainty,
emergent behavior.
Exactly. And so because I was missing a lot of that in my corpus, I kind of had this itch that had to be scratched. And, I find myself in Norway, where there is actually quite a vibrant LARP scene. So I figured I would give it a try. And I never would have sort of thought to do that unless the community here is super sort of it's very self-organizing. It's very welcoming. It's very open to new people, I'd say.
Yeah. So That's a nice segue because I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Nordic LARP angle on it because um, I love that you are a Dutch person in Norway writing a Nordic LARP. I've designed two LARPs with a Swedish collaborator, so I refer to them as my Nordic LARPs. But I also, like you, I'm a huge super fangirl of Nordic LARPs. I've been for a long time, ever since the 2010 book, which I actually picked up in Utrecht at the Digra when it was in
Mm,
Utrecht. I think it was, I want to say 2010 maybe. And I met Jaco Stein Ross and Marcus Montola there, and they had the physical book, which you can't even get anymore.
yeah.
And I just fell in love with it, and I bought it and I brought it home, and I'm always reading it, putting post-its in it.
This
Yeah,
is
I don't.
the one for this year, by the way.
Oh,
Also.
great. Yes. Fantastic. I have to check that out. But yeah, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about like what were some Nordic LARPs that you played and encountered that made you start to think about connecting Nordic LARP with the theme of time?
Mm, yeah. So the first one I played immediately kind of got me thinking, yes, this is definitely possible within Nordic LARP. It's a LARP called The Ark, written by Martin Nielsen and Karete Melon. And then she has another name.
Yeah.
People have many names here.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a game about species going extinct. And in this game, all the players play what is called an endling. Endlings are the last of a species. So Lonesome George is a very famous endling. It's the tortoise,
Yeah.
Galapagos tortoise.
Mm,
So in this game, everybody plays an endling, and as endlings together, you are aboard an ark, a ship, and you are sort of you pass by these different islands. Each island may hold the promise of more of you, right? A future for your species, but it might not. It could also disappoint. And so the game deals with themes of grief, extinction, but also found family, right? Having to sort of make do with
mm-hmm.
the people who are on the ship there with you. It involved a kind of a weird sort of being both human and animal at the same time, kind of being an anthropomorphized animal, and that
Mm-hmm.
is something that
Mm.
that I was influenced my LARP as well, because
Ah.
it also features these anthropomorphized animals. So that's the Ark, and the Ark was the first Nordic LARP I played, and it kind of cemented, or it really informed me, sort of instilled this idea in me that Nordic LARPs very often use a sort of refrain-like element, right? So there's a workshop phase where you are introduced to the fiction and to the play mechanisms, rules of consent, and then after that is kind of after all of that's clear, you enter the play phase, and during play, the facilitators in this case kind of recede to the background. And because there is a refrain and quite a clear structure for what to do, you have lots of freedom to play, and it's quite immersive, and you're not really being there's very little distraction, right? And then
Mm.
the two facilitators were quite apt with like lights and music, so there was
Mm.
that kind of stagecraft as
Mm-hmm.
well. But resulted in a really powerful production, I think, something that was really interesting. I think it was my first LARP, so I was like, wow, this is amazing. So that was really influential. I have gone on since to play many other Nordic LARPs, many of which have been less talky and much more sort of conceptual, much more non-verbal. So I feel like, and this is a kind of cliche, or sort of what you call it, like a joke that's often made about Nordic LARPs, or at least like in this kind of scene where where I find myself, is that all Nordic LARPs are like non-verbal LARPs, right? Like it's very hot right now, I think, in among the designers that I know, to design non-verbal LARPs, which
Mm.
involve other ways of communication, and so I think some of them work really, really well. So, for example, if you are sitting behind a computer right now, chances are you should look up a designer called Runa
Mm.
Essendrop.
Syndrome. I knew you were
Yeah.
going to say that. I'm like, she's going to say Nina, Yeah, you never know.
Because just
She's
because
the
the
queen of, yeah.
I think she's a legend, and I think the most interesting LARP I ever played was one of hers. It was called Sound Explorers, and it basically just kind of everybody was blindfolded. You're lying on a pillow, you're comfy, and you just vocalize with, you just say, like, you don't even say anything, you just create noise, and then because you're 8 people in a room together, you create this soundscape of noise, and then you're doing and at the same time, because Nina is a really kind of gifted sort of workshop creator, she takes you through, because so you could create a character in your mind, could be anything, and then you kind of travel through this shifting soundscape, and it's just incredible what you can do with so little, right, with just the human voice, and also the sort of shifting roles that created, right? Like sometimes you're the environment because you create with your voice the environment, but sometimes, and you create that environment for others as well, but sometimes you are your character and you're moving through that environment that's created by the others. So it's a really interesting, very sort of, yeah, sort of.
I've played that one actually. I had a really fantastic experience in London where I was there doing an artist residency in Brighton, and I don't know if you know Lizzie Stark, but she's a very well-known LARP. She actually won an award at, I think she's one of the first Americans to win a festival award, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but I was in the UK and she sent me a Facebook and she goes, Nina and Essendrop is in London and you have to go see this. You have to go do this. And so I went, and one of the things I loved about it, and I talk about it a lot, that particular LARP, was the fact that that soundscape that we created at the beginning was done under the auspices of the pregame workshop. So she told us that this was part of the workshop. We were laying there making these noises, and then when the actual LARP started, we suddenly find out that that's actually the environment that we just created. And part of the reason I love that so much is that I really love sort of co-creation as a general principle in games. I studied a lot of online communities and virtual world communities, and I love LARPs that have that kind of co-creation element in it, and it was really beautifully and elegantly executed. One of the things I was thinking when you were talking about the arc, and also the other Nina and Essendrop one that I played was I forgot the name of it now. Is it White Death? Have you done that one? That's a game where everybody dies at the end, basically. And as you were talking about the arc, I was thinking, a lot of the Nordic LARPs have a kind of a heaviness to them that is very consistent with Scandinavian literature and theater, right? Like if you go, hey, what's a Scandinavian comic play? I can't think of a one, right? So, and also the films of, Lars von Trier and those kinds of dogma people, there's kind of heavy themes. And one of the things I noticed in your description of the game was that you didn't want it to be dark in that way. You wanted it to not be depressing, because when you start talking about global warming and the Anthropocene and all that stuff, I just like want to drop my head on the table, weep. But I wanted to really hear a little bit more about that, because I feel like, how do you take something that's so dark and kind of put a positive, optimistic twist on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not quite sure eventually that I achieved what I set out to do. I think because I think ultimately there's questions of sort of mortality, ephemerality, endings. Those are always going to be uncomfortable. But I think so I was more aiming for kind of within those bounds, kind of within the bigger story of life on Earth. There is agency, and you can be empowered by knowledge, but also by sort of a sense of community that you can sort of feel with the rest of the creatures on Earth and with the changing Earth itself. So I guess a powerful affect to oppose that kind of sense of desolation is just awe. And I think you could, I mean, there are many ways to create that sense of awe, right? I mean, even pictures of the planet arguably could incite that kind of feeling. But I think in general, also like a sense of understanding of the many different faces of planet Earth, right? The many different ways in which it can change, the many different ways in which in the game you can change it, right? Because importantly, it's not like I write the future in the game. The future is co-created by the players when they exit the time machine in these subsequent jumps. So if they want to see something, if they want to see a watery planet, they just have to speak it into being. If they want to see a dry planet or something else, it's up to the players themselves to create that.
Oh, so that's really interesting because I really like that. So what you're saying is that the way to counter that kind of dark aspect is to just put more agency in the player's hands.
I'd say so, agency and understanding as well. And I mean, the players in the LARP do eventually, they have to fossilize, I guess, which is a sort of my euphemism for they have to expire, right? They have to die. They have to recommit themselves to the fossil record, because only if you recommit, right, do you in fact become part of the story, right? You can, if you're as long as you find yourself in the time machine, time is stalled. Nothing happens for you. Your character has a hard time developing, right? They can't really develop because the only way that you can develop your character or evolve your species or kind of tell a story about what your character, how it adapts to life on Earth, is by leaving the time machine behind and by living on Earth. And I guess that the caveat there is that if you want to live on Earth, you also have to die on Earth, and then maybe leave something behind. You know, the aspect of legacy
Yeah.
there is supposed to be.
I really like that idea too, that like there is no time in the time machine. That's a really interesting, just conceptually, philosophically, a way to think about a time machine as a place that's actually doesn't have time, which is cool. Do you feel like you could either run or walk through a little scenario with me out of the game? Either just describe one, or what I was thinking was either if you wanted to play something, a little segment, or tell me a story about one of the runs you did where something really interesting happened, or maybe both.
Let me see. I think we can probably play maybe a little bit of it, because even though there are some sort of embodied aspects to the game, it is also like I already said, it's kind of like a talky one in the sense that, and this is maybe when at the very beginning Celia said, because I did say about the LARP that I didn't think it was quite innovative, but maybe that is because it's not nonverbal, and it was like, oh, you know, what everybody's doing these days is nonverbal.
By the Nordic LARP trends, it's not innovative.
But what we can start to do is pick a no, actually we can start by creating the time machine. There's a little exercise in the booklet. The booklet is available for free online,
which, by the way, is really beautifully designed. I really like the art. Did you do the graphics yourself?
No, I have a good friend who created the illustrations, the color illustrations.
Yeah, it's the illustrations. It's beautiful as an object.
Yeah. I was like, yes. I mean, if you want to put a lot of text in the book, you have to woo your readers with a bit of eye candy as well. So I guess the first exercise that I play with in this LARP is called Imagining the Time Machine, and it introduces sort of a key mechanic in the game, I guess, which I've called voicing. Voicing is about gradually adding detail to the world, doing so collectively, so that at the end of the exercise, almost like a sort of impressionistic painting, you've dotted, you've kind of sort of put your little marks on on the page, and when you take a step back, there you go, there's an image. The idea was that in order to voice, you activate all your senses. So, and I guess, yeah, we can demonstrate this, Celia. I think that will be the best way
That
to go
sounds
about
fun. Let's try it.
it. Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
game.
and I'll sort of do facilitate and play at the same time, so we
Okay.
play together.
Cool.
All right, so if this was a black box theater space, I would ask everybody to line up one side of the room, backs against the wall. You're looking at the other side of the room. What you're looking at is the time machine. And initially, you're only using your eyes. So we have to describe what we see. And I'll go first. I think what I'm looking at, it's got very round edges. And Celia, I know you go and you sort of, we can add a little bit of detail together, see what
I'm going to say that
emerges.
the texture is kind of a copper patina.
Okay, copper, nice. Well, I'll say that it has a exhaust pipe that's emitting a white smoke.
Mm. There are some green lights around the edges of things.
I think there's also a door in the middle, and it's slowly being lowered like a drawbridge.
There's a panel with a lot of knobs and dials on it.
All right, we've looked at the time machine. Now it's time to take a step forward and activate our ears. What does the time machine sound like?
It has a kind of a little bit of an echoey sound when you speak in it.
I also think it's there's a clanging coming from inside. Maybe one of the parts is loose.
And I'm also hearing a little bit of a like almost a hissing sound related to the smoke that's coming out of the exhaust.
Those green lights that you described, haven't taken a step closer. I think I'm getting a little beep as they flicker on and off.
Nice.
All right.
When you turn the dials, they make a kind of a clicking noise, like something's locking into place.
All right, we're taking another step forward.
So are we physically walking forward towards the wall when we're doing this?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So so we're slowly moving. So at our next step, we're activating our sense of smell. What does the time machine smell like?
I feel like it smells a little damp.
Uh-oh.
I don't know why.
That smells
maybe from the steam, from the exhaust pipe.
Yeah. I'm getting a whiff of like an herbal scent as well. Maybe somebody cleaned the insides and I'm getting the detergent.
And somehow like a distant waft of coffee.
Oh yes, that sounds very nice. Let's get it. All right, we take one step closer to the time machine. And this time we are close enough to reach out and touch. So what does the time machine feel like?
Well, I feel like my sense is it's cold. Like when I put my hand on it, it's kind of cool and cold.
Yeah, I also think that it's maybe this is just me, but isn't it like buzzing gently? Is it like vibrating a little?
Yeah. I can. Yeah, it is. And the surface of the material is weird. It's kind of both rough and smooth at the same time. Kind of like it's distressed, but then it's been lacquered over.
And there are a couple of smooth spots still, and if you look closely, you can see your own face reflected.
Oh, that's you seeing. You can see that.
That's true, but
is that
from
okay?
up close.
Yeah, the knobs and dials, they're kind of stiff, and when you turn them, you can feel like a little, like when you hear that click, it's like it's locking into the next position.
Mm, that's very satisfying haptic feedback. All
Hmm.
right. We have one more sense to activate, and that is our taste. This one's optional. What does the time machine taste like?
I mean, I kind of just I'm getting a bit of a metallic flavor, I think.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Metallic. It is, there's a fine layer of condensation on it, so there is a little bit of moisture there on the
Hmm.
surface,
Hmm.
but not unpleasant.
And I can kind of taste that coffee smell as well. Maybe just
Yes.
because it's I'm water making my mouth water a little
Mm,
bit.
all right. Well, here we have it. This is our time machine. This is the vehicle that we're going to be using for our time jumps in a little bit. And I feel like what we've created, I'm getting lots of sort of like it's a very steampunky machine.
Hmm.
It's not usually a steampunky machine. It's been other things, but this is the first time
That's
that we've
partially
had such.
my fault because that's what I imagine an H.G. Wells kind of time machine is what
Yes.
came into my head. Or
Mm,
like Mist. There's a lot of weird little like pods and submersibles and stuff in Mist. And I think I was kind of imagining some of the things that I've seen in there. I
mhm.
really, really like that as a co-creation uh, sequence, right? It's really lovely, and I love that you're walking closer and closer to the wall as you're doing it, and the touch at the end is really nice. Um, yeah, that's great. That's a perfect bite-sized sample to do in a context like this. You did
Yeah.
good choice. I I want to so next semester I teach a class called Designing Imaginary Worlds and I usually run a LARP with the students. How long does this take to play?
Mm. I've played it in slots of 4 hours, but I think generally you need 3.5.
Mm,
But it kind of depends also on how, because the LARP has no timed ending. The LARP ends when when all players have decided to fossilize, right? So
mm,
the LARP ends when all players have left the time machine and have recommitted to life on Earth, and that could be
mm,
sooner or later. But there are
mm,
10 jumps in time, so at most, I think you have up until you have 4 hours to play.
mm. It's really nice. Um, and it's also kind of the other thing that struck me. The reason I was thinking of it for the class is the world building aspect because I like how you've made it really open ended
Mm,
and that the players can build the world as they're playing, which is really nice. Very
yeah,
cool.
that was a
Um,
fine line to walk though, because I think and once again, like I'm not sure if I've quite achieved what I set out to do, but there is on the one hand, it's really nice. World building is well, it's something that I enjoy doing, but it's also a hard thing to ask people to do when you're also making them think ahead in time, right? When you're making them think a different kind of world. And then there is also the element of science as opposed to fantasy, right? Like it's easy to, or easy, like it's imaginable. I mean, you can imagine a different kind of planet, a different kind of world, but the game sort of uh, maybe asks for a kind of a more gradual change. So you have to, and it's not like this is a hard rule of the LARP, but in general, people want to tie ends together, right?
mhm. Yeah, I think there's a couple things also that I really like about the framework that the time machine as a sort of kind of indexical scaffolding, I would call it. Like I've been writing a lot about sort of in LARPs and theater and participatory theater that if you scaffold an experience with something familiar, whether it's a social experience like say a wedding or something indexical that people can reference from something they know or have seen, right? And the time machine is such a sort of iconic starting point for an imaginary world premise. We talk a lot about this in the class actually. Um, that I think what's nice about it is it gives you something very familiar that everyone knows what it is, to introduce them to something that's unfamiliar and strange and a little hard to get your head around. So I feel like that was a really smart design choice on your part, because you picked something that's almost bordering on cliche, really, but that it becomes this really tangible and kind of like comfortable. If you had come up with a different kind of mechanism and asked us to create this thing we weren't familiar with, it would have been really hard. But it's a thing that everyone is familiar with from media and storytelling and stuff. So I think that's it. I think when you're trying to bring in something that challenging, starting with something that familiar is a really good way to create that sort of underpinning for it.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you a couple of other questions, kind of more broad. The first was just, I'd love to hear a little more about your background.
My academic background, I have degrees in English language and culture and literary studies and American studies. And then for my PhD, I basically responded to a call that was about climate fiction, but I was like, but what if games? And they were happy to accommodate me, so that was very nice. Um,
And so you're doing a fellowship at Oslo, but where's your actual PhD coming from?
Cultural studies.
No, what university?
Oh, it's called the University of Oslo.
So the fellowship and the PhD are part of the same thing.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought
Yeah,
you were
I'm a
like,
PhD candidate, but also they call it
okay.
PhD fellow here because you're not a
Okay.
student technically.
Yeah. We have weird terminology at ours. We just
Mm.
started a PhD program at my university in the arts and design program. So, but okay, so yeah, literary studies. So that's interesting. So it's kind of coming from, and it's interesting that you said the fiction, climate fiction, because that also is kind of the fiction part is the bridge for you, right, to the LARP as a form
Yeah,
of fiction. I mean, I think it's a really smart too, because a lot of speculative, when you read speculative fiction or science fiction, I watch a lot of TV sci-fi shows and stuff. It's I don't know. I like the idea of a participatory storytelling for the future that's open-ended like that. I think that's really
yeah.
nice. Um,
This was a huge reason why I think I was so keen to work with analog material because so one of my chapters in my dissertation is about futurity in games or games and climate futures.
mhm,
And because I look at a lot of playful climate simulation games, which on the surface seem to kind of offer you many different options. They're like, well, play through your policy response to the climate crisis, have at it. And then there's 100 different options to go for. And so it seems like you can build many kinds of futures, but in general, these are games with very tough victory conditions. So you're, even though there are many different types of approaches, there's only the one winning approach, the one that's sort of sanctioned by the game. So I think that very often the sort of the openness to the future that games pretend to offer is ultimately confined by conventions of video game conventions, like having to win and beat a level
mhm.
and the single playerness of it as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, the game that I mentioned that was at IndieCade, and I am really embarrassed that I'm not remembering the name. I think it was called Terra Nova. It's uh Patrick Yagoda was one of the leads on it. Ashley, oh god, totally blanking on her last name. But anyway, it was a future scenario where um they were in the future dealing with the effects of climate change, and you as a player had to help them change the present so that the outcome on their end would be better. So it's a little different because they've already created the dysfunctional dystopic future, but then they want you to kind of like undo it.
Mm.
And I like that because it kind of gives you a greater sense of agency, right? My
Mhm.
partner and I, we watch when we're watching science fiction, like every once in a while he'll turn something on and I'll go, I can't deal with all this apocalyptic stuff because it's too realistic to
Yeah.
me. Like when I see anything apocalyptic, I'm like, ah.
Uh,
So having the ability to like see something that where you feel powerless and you feel a lack of agency and then introduce agency. But the other thing that's different about yours is it's because a lot of climate change games are they kind of also deal with either like you're in the dystopic future and you just have to deal with it, or they're more systems focused. And I think in yours, that's more like individual agency focused and more subjective. Like you are the entity that is going through the extinction process. And I think that also kind of gives it and it's one of it's a classic example of like you can really only do that with a LARP. Like that's really especially with multiple people, like there's no other way to make someone feel that embodied and subjective in that experience. So I can see why you picked that, even though you're a video game scholar, as a way to express these ideas, which is really interesting.
mhm.
What I'm curious, what other video games you've been writing about? You mentioned Outer Wilds, and what was the other one?
Heaven's Vault.
Heaven's Vault. What would you like to give us a brief synopsis of kind of what your research is around those?
Yeah, for sure. I think I have, I think I can never sort of tell, but so I have a couple of chapters. Chapter one is about futurity in games. And this is where I talk about a lot of kind of more straightforward titles that engage very explicitly with climate change, like Fate of the World is a sort of kind of, it's old by now, but it is a big kind of a big title, an important title in um, the game, the field of eco games or environmental games,
Mm-hmm.
um, and there's actually another game that came out this year called Half Earth Socialism, which is plays very similarly to Fate of the World, but is much more radical, I think, in its in the kinds of policies that it allows you to play with, and that is for free online to play. So just Google Half Earth Socialism and guaranteed
What genres are these? Are they like God games or?
turn-based strategy games.
Mm,
Yeah, my second chapter is about God games. This is where
mhm,
I discuss, and this is where I do a lot of kind of visual studies now, of visual culture analysis,
mhm,
basically kind of arguing my way from those whole Earth images of the Earth from space, like Blue Marble or Earthrise. I take sort of that and I kind of bring that up to the present, where in 2020 there were 3 games that came out and they all had such similar interfaces, where you basically hover over a globe from space and you kind of you can sort of move the globe around, you tinker with it a little bit, and you basically shepherd a civilization from the Stone Age up to the Space Age. And I do a sort of kind of like a genre analysis in that chapter. The
mm,
games I talk about are Imagine Earth, The Universum, and Before We Leave. And they play very similarly. I would say Imagine Earth is the most radical, the coolest.
mhm,
But Before We Leave has space whales, so gotta play that. And chapter 3 is where this is where I discuss oil in video games. So I'm very interested in
oh,
a field of research called the energy humanities or petroculture studies, which is
mm,
basically looking at cultural expression and asking, how is this, like, can we, is this an expression of an energy system that subtends it? So famously, the Road novel or like the Road movie, you could argue is an expression of petroculture, because obviously, if we didn't have access to cheap oil, we wouldn't be cruising around the country on
mm,
leisure rides, right? And so this is where I look at how oil features in video games, And generally, a lot of video games are sort of shameless about their engagement with oil. There's lots of oil tycoon games, games where you basically play a CEO and you just gotta drill the earth for all it's worth. And like those are kind of examples of what's been called dark play, play where you embrace morally reprehensible subject positions or kind of questionable gameplay, often in a jokey manner, right? So I'm not super dismissive of these games. I think they perform their function.
They're
And I think,
satirical in a way.
yeah, a lot of them are a little satirical, or they are hard to read in the sense that, they're games. So like they're not being, and I think they might be mobile games, or they might be games that aren't pretend, like they don't have aspirations to be taken seriously. So
Though, can I have a quick digression with you on this though?
mhm.
It really makes me think about the Values at Play project, Mary Flanagan and Helen Nissenbaum's. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they did this study a few years ago on the underlying values of game mechanics. They developed a set of design tools to help designers create more values aware games. But what strikes me as you're talking is like there is this kind of problem in game creation of a kind of a subset of games that are really operating at a really sort of ethics free level, like, because as you're saying this, I'm thinking I'm pretty sure a lot of those developers don't even think about the ethical implications of those games, and whether they're humorous or not, they don't even care. Right, and it goes with this kind of whole set of, it sort of sits alongside of this whole set of a sort of pro-colonial, like there's a whole series of board games and video games that sort of begin with the assumption of colonialism, which goes along with exploitation of Earth's resources, right? So I remember playing a game a long time ago, one of those kind of civilization-y kinds of games that it was newer, but it was like some indie game and it seemed really cool. And I started playing it and I'm like, they want me to cut trees down. I don't want to cut trees down, but I can't actually do anything else in this game but cut trees down, and I can't win if I don't cut trees down. So I stopped because I was like, I don't want to cut trees down,
Yeah.
right? But like, that's not something people think of in their head. Like, oh, I'm telling people it's good to cut trees down. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's this kind of obliviousness to those kind of ethical considerations in some of the genres you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I think conventions, sort of gameplay conventions, gameplay genre, those strictures still mean very much to designers, and also to get your games to the right audience, because there are so many different types of games. So it really helps to know
Hmm.
your genre. Um,
Hmm.
and so, yeah, and I think that just means that many developers, yeah, don't really think about, yeah, or don't care, I
They
guess.
don't, yeah, they don't care. They don't think critically about, especially if it's a well-weathered genre that they just keep regurgitating the same genre without interrogating any of its underlying values. So like that kind of civilization, rape the landscape, take over other people's cultures thing. Like they never go, oh, maybe we should rethink that. You know what I mean? Like, um, there was another thing I was going to ask. Oh, it also made me think of the Landlord's Game, because the Landlord's Game was originally created as an anti-capitalist game, and then it was appropriated and flipped into a pro-capitalist game.
Mm.
Um, and when it was first designed, it was a serious activist political game with an agenda, and then it sort of turned into this, entertainment game that doesn't really have a kind of deep underlying ethical message.
Yeah.
So.
But I think very often, like what does satire look like in video games, right? To recognize something as being satirical, you got to look for things like tone. You have to kind of look on this at the surface. And I think,
Mhm.
I mean, still, but less and less so, thankfully, video game scholars are still taught to look through the surface at game mechanics.
Mhm.
So
Oh,
it's really,
yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was just showing my students September 12th the other day, which is a satirical game about um bombing, trying to kill terrorists by bombing a city. And
Mhm.
every time you kill civilians by accident, which you can't help but do because the bomb takes a while to go down, um, they turn into terrorists. But it's got this very cartoony, it looks like and I think it's sort of been compared to, even by its creator, to a political cartoon,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
It's got that tone to it. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Like the surface is what tells you if something's a satire or not. Huh.
Yeah,
Okay, so
because how otherwise? I mean, the September 12th though is that's by Ian Bogost, right? Like that is though a
no, no,
very
no, no, no. It's Gonzalo Frasca.
Fresca. Okay, yeah, yeah, cool. But
Bogus
who's
made just
also
a
a ludologist though,
yeah,
so he's also
Bogus
saying
made
like,
yeah, exactly. Even though, yeah, it's interesting that it sort of almost contradicts his philosophy. Um, no, but yeah, Ian Bogost made Airport Insecurity and Disaffected, which are also considered sort of
mm,
digital political cartoons in that sense, and it meant to be satirical as well.
mm.
Okay, so the next chapter, sorry, we digressed into the chapter about
Yeah, so that was my chapter about oil. And my next chapter is about deep time. So this is where I look at the way in which, so I guess quoting directly from that chapter, video games are no strangers to deep time, right? So civilization spans
mhm,
the Neolithic to the recent future.
mhm,
Spore is about, life itself, how it develops
mhm,
from its microbial state, like the primal soup, all the way up until the space age. So like, lots of video games are about huge, big spans of time, but they do look at time kind of like as progressive, right? Over
mhm.
time, things grow in complexity, things develop. Um, Generally, sort of the passage of time. You can kind of look back on the passage of time and see pride or see and there's no end in sight also, right? So very often these games they just kind of spin off into the future ad infinitum. And the games that or the questions I ask in this chapter are about cyclical rhythms in deep time, right? So where something develops, but
Oh,
then also crashes. A species arises and then goes extinct. An empire
mm.
rises and falls. And so those are, and then on top of that, sort of seasonal rhythms and cosmological rhythms as well, right? Because both
Mhm.
Outer Wilds and Heaven's Vault are about entropic worlds, right? Worlds that have beginnings, and sometimes those beginnings are anthropogenic in the sense that they were man-made, but they also have endings. And the two games, Heaven's Vault and Outer Wilds, are about coming to grips with those endings. Both games are about a sort of looping temporality that you have to figure out, and then you figure out that the loop is in fact not a loop, or it's you have to break the loop, and you have to, yeah, really come to terms with what it means
Mm.
to end. And they are also about like looking back at history and recognizing that we had ancestors who also peaked and then fell.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. There were two things popped into my head. One of them was a little earlier when you were talking about Spore. Spore is actually based on Powers of 10. I don't know if you knew that, the Eames film. And that's the other thing that I thought of when you were first talking about your game, was that I think Powers of 10 is the closest thing I've seen to trying to do what you're doing with your game. That it tried to use film, the film medium, to tell a story about scale that's very hard for humans to comprehend.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a parallel idea, conceptually kind of a parallel idea. But also, when you were talking about the progressiveness of those kind of colonial models or whatever, I was just listening to NPR, some marketplace or something like that yesterday, National Public Radio over here, which is a thing. I know most European countries like it's much bigger, but here it's just a little niche audience. But anyway, there was a guy talking there about growth and about the idea of growth and how the sort of post Adam Smith, whatever Keynesian idea about economic growth imagines growth to be infinite and have no consequences. And he was like, we need to rethink what we mean by growth. And he was talking about like, we need to think about sustainability as part of our criteria for growth, not just NGP. And we need to think about human well-being. They kept talking about Scandinavia over and over again. Like, oh, well, Scandinavia, that's what it should be like. This cracks me up.
It's a big facade. It's just, it's so strange. I mean, like, yeah, I guess there is some social security here, but yeah, these are definitely neoliberal governments as well.
Yeah.
And like Norway only gets to, you know, sort of be proud about its sustainability while, you know, they're still speculating and sort of, I mean, they're still going to open new oil
and
fields.
Isn't there a big oil spill in Norway right now going on? I thought.
Oh my
No, I
God.
thought there was.
I did not look at the news today.
Well, wasn't there some kind of? I thought that pipe, that the Russian pipe that got blown up was.
Oh, it's a gas pipe, which means that yes, there is gas in the.
Oh, it's gas. It's gas. That's
yeah,
right.
but the pipe itself wasn't in use, so there was gas in the pipe, but not as much, thankfully, as if the because it had already been shut because of the war in Ukraine.
Okay, that makes sense. So where were we? We don't have to go through the entire dissertation. I was just trying.
I have one more chapter, which I can be really brief about. It's basically about seasonality in video games. Specifically dark seasonality, which is what I think it's a trend, because increasingly I see video games where the environment is destabled, and kind of instead of fighting enemies, you're fighting the weather, right? So in Frostpunk, you have to survive this horrendous blizzard that's coming at your city. In Timberborn, you have to weather this dry season that's kind of longer and longer every cycle. So it's basically PvE, but with the environment, with a sort of unpredictability.
Harsher, and the environment itself, because when we say PvE, we mean everything that isn't players, as opposed to PvP, right? PvE just means fighting things other than players, but you're talking about environment with the big
yeah,
like
literally environment.
The environment, yeah, that's fascinating. So interesting. Wow. It sounds really like a lot of work to do that much. And I would also say, by the way, that you could probably publish that as a book. It sounds like something people would read. Just saying.
I'm looking for publishers. I've got one in mind maybe, but yeah, we'll see.
Well,
it still has to be revised quite a bit.
Send me an email, I'll see what I can do. Cool. This is really interesting to see this perspective too, because I didn't really know much about you before when this game came in and we talked about putting it on my show, but it really intrigues me, and maybe this is a good kind of final question to kind of ask you, is the fact that you're a scholar of video games, and you touched on this at the very beginning, but I'd love to hear a little more about it. It's like, why did you decide to make a LARP?
Yeah, I mean, also I don't code, so it's kind of like work with the skills that you have. I think so. It was I was keen to do a LARP because I knew also that it would have an output, right? And I'm very motivated by, I want my projects to be seen by the world. I want them to be played. That's kind of what motivates me to put stuff on paper. And so I knew that I could pitch this LARP at Grenselandet, at like the local Oslo LARP festival, for which I've also now been recruited as an organizer, because the LARP scene is very small, but super self-organized. So you're always both a designer, but then also you get roped into
exciting.
Organization.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how IndieCade is. Everybody, yeah, go ahead. Anyway,
but so I knew that I had an output for that, right? And then the pandemic happened, and then for the longest time we could not meet, and I couldn't play test. And so there was a whole summer where I was like, well, I guess I'll make a hypertext. So I also made a hypertext of the game, which is linked on my itch page as well, and freely available. And so I guess I tried like different kinds of media, but but I always wanted to play it as a LARP, and I've only really been grown more kind of fond of the medium, and I'm working on my second LARP as we speak, which will probably
So
be tested in February.
can you give us a sneak peek of what it's about?
Yes, it's thank you for asking. It's called Leviathan, and it's about, so players play a community of people who live on the back of a great beast that's swimming through an immense ocean. And
Mm,
when the beast dives, the play space shrinks, and when the beast comes up, the play space expands. And over the course of the game, each character has a different relationship to the beast. And over the course of the game, that relationship will be tested. So the game is also informed by this work that I do on dark seasonality, on the sort of unpredictability of weather, the environment, the tides.
mm. I can already see that you have a very distinctive style. It's the way, kind of, because both of those pieces really engage with nature in an interesting way that I've really never seen. With maybe the one exception is this game. I'm not sure what the name of it is, but it's a game where everybody plays a rock. I think it's Nordic also. Lizzie's run it with my class a few times.
Is it by a designer called Felix?
I think so, but I can't remember. But everyone has to sit in the room and be a rock. And my students, one of my students cried and told me afterwards, like, I cried during that. It's really cool. But it's that kind of like sublime, sort of very kind of connected with nature in an interesting way. But with yours, there's a little bit of a fantasy element that I find really interesting, like a specific aspect of nature that's embodied through a kind of a fantastical framework. It's really
I think
nice.
this is also because, and this is a conversation that I've had with many friends and colleagues, and this is also something that I saw in my research, right? Games that are most explicitly about the environment, they tend to polarize and they don't quite find as wide an audience.
Mm.
If games are very kind of subtly or very metaphorically about the environment, then people do tend to play them. And that's
Oh,
kind of
that's really interesting. That's a good insight. Have you designed any other games? Are these the only ones you've done, or
yes, yeah. I've not.
okay?
I mean,
I
I
mean,
like
it
written
makes
my own
sense.
TTRPG like
It
campaigns, but that's it.
it seems to me like logical that as a person with a literature background, the LARP would feel like a comfortable expression to you because it is a form of literature.
Mm.
You know, in the New England Intercon group is called interactive. You know, they think of themselves as interactive literature in a way, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's been, oh, you asked me earlier about at the break about academics and IndieCade. So this might be, I'll just mention this because it's also a segue to the announcements that I have. So there's always been this really strong connection between IndieCade and academia on a bunch of different levels. One is that we, in the very beginning, we made a choice not to segregate the student games from the regular indie games. And so we've always shown a lot of student games on equal footing with other indie games. And many of the student games we've shown have been published. So going back to our very first year, I think 5 or 6 of the student games that were at the first festival ended up getting published. But the other thing is that a lot of academic faculty are involved in organizing IndieCade, and it's a little bit of in the US, especially because it's very hard for people to get paid to do things like IndieCade. We have relied very heavily on academics who get tenure points for volunteering and organizing events, as you know. So it's sort of in the currency of the realm, it's beneficial for us to work on things like IndieCade, But I think the other thing is that I think the academic community gravitated around IndieCade because a lot of those people were interested in moving games as an art form forward. Because also for somebody like you, as a person who is a scholar of games, having games be an art form is also beneficial, even if you're not making them.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So like very early on, we had a lot of panels about like sort of thinking about game criticism in a different way. Because historically game criticism, I mean, when I was coming up as a game designer in the 80s and 90s, it was like magazines were basically just big commercials to sell the games, and the only thing it would tell you was like, are the weapons better than the last version of this multiple sequel game? Right? So like it's just not very sophisticated. So there is a kind of a symbiotic relationship, and in fact in my book about the history of IndieCade, there's like a whole chapter about this, about kind of what I call the strange bedfellows of indie games and academia, and why those two communities have developed this kind of symbiotic relationship. And even this last 2 years since the pandemic, we started a new event called IndieCade Horizons, which is a student showcase. But we realized that all of these different people were having regional showcases physically at their sites before the pandemic. And the problem with that is then only people that can go there can see them.
Mm.
So by moving to creating a multi-institutional online showcase event, it means everybody can see all the student games and in the country and outside the country for the schools. We have a few international schools involved. You can literally just go to this thing for 2 days and see all the student games. So, so that's also another aspect of that. So this is a good segue. We have, I wanted to announce we have a couple of things coming up in December. We're going to be, so Beyond Screens is a collaboration between IndieCade and Playable Theatre, which is an organization that I started that's focusing on live games, particularly LARPs and theater kind of projects, the kind of the bridge between LARPs and interactive theater and that space. So we partnered with IndieCade to do Beyond Screens, and we've also partnered with IndieCade to create the Playable Theatre Symposium, which will be taking place December, I think it's 4th and 5th. And I think there's probably a card going up about now describing it. Oh, and Laura, I forgot to just say thank you. It was so fun talking to you. I love your game, and I'm really looking forward to playing it and running it even. So
Thank you.
thanks so
Yeah,
much for
such a
coming
pleasure
on the
to be
show,
here.
and good luck.
Cheers.
Yeah, so Laura's also a nominee / finalist for IndieCade 2022, which is going to be taking place online this year again, IndieCade Anywhere and Everywhere, as we like to call it. And for people that are interested, the festival will be happening basically, I think up at the week before the awards will be the 4th and 5th, the weekend of the 4th and 5th. I think it's the 4th. I don't have the dates, but I'm sure that the video splash screen will talk about this. Yeah, so what we're doing this year is really unusual, which is that we're having the festival on Steam. So all of the games in the festival are going to be on Steam and accessible for people to play. And any game that isn't a Steam game, like this one, will have some video clips. And also, we did these specific shows to essentially figure out a way, as we always have, to accommodate non-digital or non-conventional games that can't really be, downloaded onto your laptop. Although your game arguably can be downloaded onto your laptop. So for people that are interested, those games will all be on Steam during that week, as well as videos of the non-digital games, and then we'll be having the awards that first weekend of November. So I think we're going to show a little splash reel, sizzle reel, or whatever about the festival. And again, thanks for coming, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks at IndieCade Everywhere and Anywhere and Everywhere. Thanks a lot for coming.